And for the moderator, I'd like to introduce Nick Laneman. He is the Center Director for SpectrumX, which is the National Science Foundation Spectrum Innovation Center. And he's a professor of electrical engineering at Notre Dame. So over to you, Nick.
Thank you, Keith. Looks like the audio is working. All right, so this is all about spectrum innovation, and I think it's pretty innovative that Silicon Flatirons decided to have an engineer moderate a panel. So picking up from the previous conversation, I'm really excited to be here. I've admired Silicon Flatirons for many years, and so it's great to be involved with CU Boulder more generally in the context of SpectrumX, and to be here at Silicon Flatirons in particular, so thank you all. So we've got a great panel, a great set of discussions to seed and translate into our breakout session this afternoon. Let me very quickly introduce these exceptional panelists. And it looks like they're not quite in order as they're listed in the program. So starting at my far right is Al Gasiewski from CU Boulder. And then we have Khlopin from the NTIA. We have Jennifer Manner from EchoStar. And then last but not least, Melissa Midzor from NIST and NASTN. So I did a bit of prep work for this panel. We sort of agreed and met, chatted a bit as a group to decide to kind of converge on some questions that we want to address. And we do look forward to Q&A from the audience. I'll just go ahead and get us started off then. So first of all, given some of the issues that were raised, this panel is focused on trying to look ahead towards solutions, right? So I want to triple underline that word solutions in the title of our panel and challenge all of us to think about such solutions. So given these recurring issues in interference challenges, can any of them be solved by one of these areas of technical, economic, or regulatory? Or is it really going to be a mix of the three? And by the way, our panel is kind of set up in such a way that people can jump in as they like. But Derek, I thought we'd maybe start with you on that question.
Sure, thank you, and appreciate the opportunity to be here. It's been a great discussion so far this morning. I think jumping right into that question, I have a sense we're all going to end up saying it's a combination of all three. But again, to me, in an ideal world, it's technical, right? That's how we get to the solutions. But I think if we're honest about it, we really need the regulatory framework in place. I think the economic issue is a little trickier because I think we have spectrum users a lot of different motivations for your activity. And I think if we focus exclusively on the economic side of it, we'd have some challenges there. I also think the question in a way is a little tricky because I don't think we've heard this morning, we're not going to get rid of these challenges. It's going to be how are we going to address them, right? And how do they emerge? And I think there's a number of things here. One being actual cases of interference, right? Where we're trying to resolve those. But I think the bigger challenge we have is the predicting interference. And not to go down a whole nother thread, but on the idea of experiencing interference versus harmful interference, right? So those are challenges you've got to tackle as well too. But again, I think in a perfect world, we have a regulatory and policy framework that allows us to address these issues as quickly as we possible, which means bringing the technical side into it. I think the economic considerations are part of it, but they kind of drive at the top. But again, if you're talking about big picture on frameworks and policies on how we solve these issues, the economics come into play, but on a case-by-case basis, it really is about the technical work, and we need to have a framework that allows the technical experts to come together.
It's not an us versus them.
No,
lawyers versus engineers, for example.
No, it's not. I think the lawyers or policymakers get the framework in place, but it's the technical folks who have to have the technical solutions. We need to get to a framework where, where we have a commonality of, accepting some best practices or guidelines there. I know Austin commented on this. In a perfect world, we get to where there's less disputes up front on how we do this work and the methodologies and the testing and the analysis. And then, then you can have conversations about the results, right? And the results may end up there. You may have levers to pull on the policy side, which may bring in the economics, right? You may be weighing different factors. You may be weighing societal benefits, but the baseline really should come back to the technical.
Al, I know you wanted to jump in on this one.
So yeah, I will jump in as the third admitted engineer in the room. And I'm very happy that we have more lawyers involved because that means out of scarcity, my salary goes up too. But with regard to TER, yeah, it's got to be all three. There's no question about it. That's clear. But the E and the R, the economic and the regulatory, they do also drive the technology because clearly, if you don't have economic forces in place, you don't have the engineering groups available, the stable of engineers sometimes that are needed in companies to make new advancements. And regulatory matters also impact this because when you do have regulations, it does push companies and therefore their engineering staff to think about new solutions. So that's quite important. On the other hand, engineering developments, the technology part of it, they don't just regularly happen. I think a lot of people who aren't engineers somehow think that, well, you just put a fair amount of money in your budget and you keep hiring engineers and you have a large enough number of them and that works. And generally speaking, there's something they're missing. And that is for engineers to do their stuff, light bulbs have to go off. Light bulbs that are sometimes little, Christmas light bulbs with regard to little ideas that make a piece of code finally function, all the way up to the biggest, brightest floodlights that came from people like Nyquist and Shannon, for instance. Those kind of things have to happen. They don't happen in a vacuum. Their probability of happening is increased by the regulatory pressures, by the economic incentives. And if those are increased, generally speaking, the probability of those light bulbs going off happens more. And then it's those light bulbs going off that become the technology solutions that I think allow us to proceed in solving these interference issues.
Thanks, Al. Do you want to jump in?
So, I agree with both the previous speakers, excuse me, but I would also say getting out in front and having the technical work done before anything's even developed is critically important. So I think we're seeing a number of situations now where there's decisions being made perhaps without that technical basis. In terms of regulatory decisions, I'll point to one, which is the FCC just authorized LINX, which is a satellite system that's going to be used terrestrial spectrum on their satellite, but there's been little to no technical analysis of whether there'll be interference issues. The FCC did put a number of restrictions on them, whether they're the right or the wrong restrictions, we'll see. But I am a little worried that we're not moving earlier to do the technical analysis, and sometimes the regulation moves ahead. And I know there's a real jump. We want to get new technology out. We want connectivity. Certainly, we all support that. I work for a satellite company. Believe me, I care nothing more than getting everyone connected. I'd love you all to be our customer. But the fact of the matter is you have to do the technical work. So while I do think it's all three, I think both the other speakers agreed it's the technical that has to drive it. And there's one piece that's not here, which is the day-to-day interference. Many operators experience harmful interference, accidentally or on purpose, and have to work together to do that. And I think that's one area. I know we're going to talk a little later about incentives, but that's one area which I do think works pretty well because there is a mutual need to have no harmful interference. So people are willing to work together. And I kind of put that, I don't even know if you really need such a regulatory or economic incentive that you kind of have that already or a framework. So just some thoughts there.
I just wanted to emphasize having them in the room together. And with all three, you can't have just regulatory and economic and the technical separately. We're working on evaluating the ecosystem of CBRS, and it's been very interesting to see when we have, here are the rules coming from the regulatory side, what you can't have the information on. The engineers and the scientists will rise to the challenge and try to figure out, okay, what new ways can we measure this? What new ways can we get the information that we need? But understanding why those rules are in place and why they're important. So both privacy laws and mission critical, classified information weighed against, my life would be a lot easier if I could just measure that, but I understand why we can't just measure that. And so having all those people in the room together has really helped move the conversation forward. And also coupled with the economic is that we also, on the economic side, understand the drivers of, well, we're trying to solve this cool technical problem against the regulatory limitations. The economic drivers really help us hone in on what's the most important question I should be asking and solving at this particular time in Junction 2. So those three working together, all three need to be at the table as we move our way over time to these issues.
Yeah, I find it's really fascinating when you look at the history of spectrum regulation and management. There's been innovation either on the technology side or on the economic point of view or on the regulatory side in various stages throughout the years. And it's fascinating to see the interplays among them. And so I do think that they're intimately coupled. And so that's why I like this notion of innovation, maybe spectrum innovators as opposed to lawyers or engineers as a field. All right, so here's a provocative one that we agreed to address. If you were ruler for a day, if you were the grand arbiter between the FCC, the NTIA, et cetera, what changes would you make in spectrum management to mitigate or prevent harmful interference issues from cropping up, especially the loud public ones that make the news? And I think Al wanted to take this one on first.
Yeah, and I'm going to change that phrase from ruler to persuader in chief, because I don't think there is such a thing as a ruler anymore. But supposing I was that individual, we are doing a lot in that area right now. We have a number of government entities in place that attempt to do exactly that. I think one of the things that we're missing is being able to reach out from those government entities that could help resolve these conflicts and draw in enough people, often enough from around the country, even outside the country, to help develop these mitigation methods. I see that, now in the COVID era, of course, people can work for a company and be anywhere in the globe just by Zoom. Why can't we be doing more of that from the standpoint of engaging the engineers as well as the lawyers, so to speak, all around the country to address some of these problems as need be? Some of the most successful small companies I've seen form around projects, and the people who work on these projects are not necessarily contiguous. They're not even full-time employees of the company. They come together for a particular project, and when that project is over, they dissipate. It's just that the right people are brought together on. And I think we could be doing a little bit more of that to help make these activities already being effectively managed by FCC and NTIA more effective.
Thanks, Al. Melissa?
So if I was ruler for the day, I think one thing, and then building on what Jennifer said earlier, is we need to identify and fund risk reduction studies with more emphasis on the technical side. We do a good job with the initial modeling to understand where the issues are, but there's a lot that can be done on the technical side. One of the catch-22s is that until we sell the spectrum, there's not equipment to go test to see what's going to be causing the impact. But there are many ways where you can make proxies and you can make reasonable assumptions on the technology to help determine what some of those potential impacts might be. And having that additional information up front before the auctions would help incumbents have a better understanding of the potential impact to their systems. For the investors and industry, it would give them a better idea of the value of the frequency band that they're attempting to buy. And then, of course, you always have the post-auction measurements, but there's a lot we should be doing before the auctions to really help inform both sides, incumbents and investors.
I think it's simple. You just make NTIA the ruler. Nobody can question. No, but yeah, exactly. Yeah. No, I mean, there's a lot of things, and I think some of these ideas, and I'll come back to what I said before and what Austin said. I think you actually, if we could lock everybody in the proverbial room for a week, or all stakeholders, and come up with and I know this is a little pie in the sky, but a framework or guideline document for particularly the technical analysis, right? So you'd have a set of best practices or guidelines on how you perform X study. What are the parameters that are accepted? Can you actually agree on some things? And I know it's a challenge, right? Because you need the input and the parameters from a lot of different parties, but the modeling, the statistical analysis, the propagation, can you agree on a propagation model? Those type of things. So, when these things come up, you have them. And then, the flip side of that being, you would agree that these are more or less, binding in a way, right? I mean, I know that's not perfect because then you get into the regulatory side and facts may change. So, I mean, that would be great. It's a little theoretical, but I kind of feel like we have a lot of these activities, even something like this, but where we talk about a national strategy or you have a report, but something that would be more technically based where you could get to some level of consensus, knowing it's not perfect, but it would at least be a baseline. I think would be great. And again, how you actually get that done is obviously a challenge, but we're not going to have a ruler for the day anyway, really. So it's kind of theoretical.
Well, actually, I can be a ruler for the day. So I just want to touch on what you did, Derek, because I don't know if you lived through the FCC's negotiated rulemaking process in the 90s, putting us all in the room. It was, and we only met in person, then there was no Zoom, and I know a couple of my colleagues were there, was incredibly painful and was incredibly difficult to get to solutions. And that was really just with the commercial industry. So putting in the government folks, and I'm not saying it's a bad idea and we shouldn't try. I'm just saying I'm less hopeful. So I'm not quite sure how we get there, especially as politics are involved. So I would say I would take a step back. I think one of the problems we have with Spectrum today is that we make decisions before a lot of what we end up with, our studies are based to defend decisions that we've made, not based on technical facts. And I blame Julie and Dale for me being so fact-based. And it's something I was certainly taught at a young age. And so I do worry that we have certain outcomes that we want to achieve. We want to do something with C-band. We want to use Ka-band for something. And so a lot of what we end up doing is shaping, there's studies that are shaped around the results we want. And I think we need to take a step back. We may still have a policy or a goal in mind, but I think we really have to take a step back and look at this technically, not just in band, but also adjacent band, and something that I'm increasingly concerned with that Julie, I know, doesn't agree with me, which is aggregate interference. I think we've been arguing about this. Okay, you're good now? Okay. Okay, so, but aggregate, but really take a look at these issues and then also look at the use. I hate to say it, there are certain uses that are, can be seen as important, even if they're not the most economically advantageous to the US economy. The science services, space services, other things that, maybe a lot of people don't think about. So I think we have to take a step back. That's something I'd like to see, is that we actually maybe do some work beforehand and look at it a little more neutrally, as opposed to putting out a proceeding and making a decision and saying, okay, folks, this is what we're doing. And we do that a little bit with the NOI process at the FCC. But even then, it's really done with pretty much a clear purpose in my mind. And I don't know how you get there. So that's where I look at my subjects to determine how to implement this. So thank you.
So I thought about this question a little bit, and I'm going to react to kind of real time to what I'm hearing. Maybe one thing that I would do if I were appointed ruler is set a deadline for a national spectrum strategy and an editorial committee and a chief author or editor of that committee who would be responsible for getting that document produced. I don't know what you all think about that.
What would that document have? What would that look like? I mean, it's very easy. I can do a 1-paragraph national spectrum strategy, or I can do a 4,000-page.
Yeah, we'd have to figure out the expectations for that document, but there's a lot of talk about creating the next generation of the spectrum pipeline, right? So identifying some of these bands, but being a little bit more holistic about it, the way you describe. Figuring out the respective roles of the FCC and the NTIA, kind of as an outgrowth of their MOU. I'd liken it to, we wrote a proposal to get the SpectrumX grant, and then our first homework assignment was to develop what they called an implementation plan. And so that became a couple 100-page document. So if we did something along those lines, I think that would be pretty constructive.
So I have a comment along those lines. And we've had NRC committees study spectrum issues before, and I was on 2 of those committees studying passive uses of the spectrum for earth science and active uses for earth science. It seems like the NRC might be a place to begin that study, recognizing that it's not just purely technical, though, but it is very much political. And there have to be a number of sociological issues brought in, fairness, for example, and access to spectrum, fair trade policies. It's a lot more so than what they're used to working on. But that kind of a committee, it sounds like you're really leaning towards.
You know, in my formative years, for example, the PCAST report and the National Broadband Plan, you know, those were substantial documents that really fueled a lot of activity for the last 10 years or so. I think we could potentially create something of that ilk.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. All right. So in some sense, it all comes down to incentives. Spectrum allocation and management has many different stakeholders. What incentives might help prevent new issues from arising? It sounds like Melissa would like to take this one on first.
I would. I actually would like to address two aspects of that incentive. One of them is mission-based and the other one economic. A good example for a mission-based one, and I've been pounding the sidewalk on this, I had 15 years formally in electronic warfare in the DoD, is I think spectrum sharing is the best thing that could have ever happened to the DoD. We need to learn how to operate in a spectrum we don't control. And what better place to try that than at home before you go overseas and try and do it for real. So I've been part of the small group in the DoD helping try to push that. The other one is an economic one, and that I think, Albin, you mentioned that earlier, is fair coexistence. If we could objectively measure fair usage of a shared band. Right now, it's an incumbent's priority, right? The modem is that if you're joining, like in Wi-Fi or in Bluetooth, if you're joining the spectrum, you have to not cause any more additional information than if the incumbent was just adding another system. So, but you're not really looking at what's fair across the whole band and all users and really optimizing the spectrum usage by using the, if I got there first, I get priority model. So I think having the methodology, the metrics, the method in order to measure what fair coexistence, first you have to agree what fair coexistence is, but then you need to be able to measure it and be able to enforce it. So I think that could actually provide an incentive, because if I was a new company and I knew I would have a shake at a fair use of the spectrum and share it and not just have to figure out how I'm going to fit in, that would provide more incentive to try and to launch into these new spectrums.
Thanks, Melissa. Derek?
Incentives, it's such a tricky issue. It's one that's, you could probably go back 20, 30 years and we've been talking about this. In the big picture, I think the market has a number of incentives for the commercial side. I'm not sure they're always as strong as advertised. I mean, particularly in the world, if you have exclusive licensing and you have the spectrum, what are your incentives to operate as efficiently there as possible? I don't know. I think there's a lot of questions there. I think you're naturally incentivized to avoid causing interference because of the problem that creates, and and vice versa. But a little closer to home, looking at the federal use side, I mean, this is something we've struggled with a long time, and there's been a lot of different proposals on there on how do you incentivize the agencies. And Melissa made a great point on sharing, and I think we're seeing that. The other larger point for federal agencies is the federal spectrum footprint continues to shrink, it doesn't grow, right? So you're operating in a condensed environment, you will be going forward. There's always going to be a demand for more commercial access. So I think you have a natural incentive to try to maximize what you have. But the other part of it is, getting into the weeds a little more is the actual process of transitioning spectrum to the commercial side. And we're under laws now where you get reimbursed for spectrum relocations. But there's a lot of limitations on it, and some of it's for good policy reasons. For example, an agency can replace its systems with comparable capability, they call it, right? Well, I think the real incentive would be if there was a better opportunity to upgrade those systems and deploy new technology and utilize some of that, the massive economic streams coming in from spectrum auctions, so that the agencies could actually do more with their spectrum. And you could have an efficiency hook in there, right, too, where you can get new capabilities, new equipment, new systems, but you have to demonstrate, the spectrum efficiency components of that. So I think that's one sort of, small piece of it that I think is something that we're thinking about a lot more.
Now?
On the technology side regarding incentives, there is a project that we started developing under an NSF EARS program, and now it's being further developed under a SWIFT program, to develop a spectral broker. And the broker operates kind of like a traffic cop on one of those European piazzas where everybody's trying to get through, but they don't want to ding each other's fenders. So the traffic cop is up there giving directions. You kind of request you want to go in, traffic cop waves you through. The broker is doing that basically on a millisecond basis at 100 kilohertz spectral intervals and over perhaps 10-kilometer regions regularly to people who want to access a certain chunk of what we call electrospace. And the broker can't issue tickets. It's not the kind of traffic cop that can write you one and take you to court. Instead, it's a suggestion. You put in your request to use that electrospace, and within a millisecond, you get your response back. It's either go, you're clear, or no go. You're going to get dinged by somebody. And that has actually an incentive structure, because as more and more users buy into it, there's more and more opportunities for the broker to come up with the proper routes so that effectively people can get through the piazza without bashing each other's fenders. In other words, remove the potential for interference. And the more you buy into it, the more you get to use it, in other words, by effectively being part of that. And think of it the other way around. Let's say you want to get through the piazza with your car and you don't want to pay attention to the traffic cop. You're going to get your fenders dinged more often. So that's the whole idea of the incentive structure behind this broker.
So I kind of really like that, but because I was thinking of this, I'm a little negative on incentives. I think you can't incentivize people unless you have realistic scenarios. And we've seen that in a number of bands. Jennifer Warren mentioned how the satellite industry is very good at sharing because we've always had to share. But the problem is people we're sharing with now may not be as good. And I'll give you an example of something the FCC decided to create a shared band at 27.5 to 28.35 gigahertz for the UMFUs. Austin mentioned UMFUs earlier, so I'm not going to define it. Well, I think she defined it for us because I couldn't remember what the definition is. But I looked to her. UMFUs and FSS, fixed satellite service, largely for individually licensed earth stations or gateways. And so who's coming in first is supposed to have the right for that location. And there's huge restrictions on how the satellite operators can operate. We can't be near road highways. We can't be near football field stadiums of 10,000 people or more. We can't be near ports. We can't be, I'm sure we can't be near amusement parks. Anyway, there's this exhaustive list that we fought very hard. And what's ended up happening is it's been very hard. It's been a very hard process because it's not realistic for many of the satellite operators to find a location where there's access to fiber and people to operate the gateway stations in the very strict confines that the FCC created. And so that's a situation where I think maybe a traffic cop would work better than putting in place kind of this unrealistic, kind of quasi-geographic separation requirements than we've seen. So that's why I find that this question of incentives is hard. I think getting ourselves together, self-interest, I think is always best, but we see a lot of people who will look for reasons, anti-competitive reasons to block people from sharing. So I consider to think that you've got to start with what realistically can share and go back to the technical basis that I think we've been talking about, which is if you don't start with a real technical understanding, you're not going to get to even able to incentivize sharing.
So I'll jump in and say that one thing I've observed that's been fascinating and somewhat from the outside is this notion of spectrum relocation funds being invested for R&D through the National Spectrum Consortium. And so initially that was very heavily focused on enabling legacy DoD systems to better coexist. But in recent years, there's been a growing emphasis on 5G and securing 5G. So I see this as an interesting way in which these two ecosystems have the potential to collide and negotiate completely different ways, even within DoD, of using commercial technology and also meeting the demands of its mission. And I think that the best innovator for spectrum sharing could be DoD itself, using some of these evolving technologies, using private 5G type networks, and their additional, very specialized systems. It would be fascinating to see if that actually comes to fruition. I think they have plenty of incentive to take advantage of the economies of scale of these technologies, and we're seeing that. The biggest issue, of course, is the security constraint, as far as I can tell. So I think being innovative in the way that individual agencies and these ecosystems kind of collide might help incentivize more and higher and better use of spectrum. I don't know if any of you want to react to that.
No, I think you said it well. I think that is something interesting. I think we're all watching and to some extent participating in. And Liz, you kind of hinted at that too with the DoD effort here with spectrum sharing. DoD's interested in a new environment, and they see the world around them, not just going to 5G, but the capabilities there are very different. We talk about the connected warfighter. So you kind of have an offensive and then a defensive approach there as well too, and it's going to be interesting. So I agree with you though. A lot of the focus around the DoD work has been looking at their legacy systems and how you coexist. But I think where they're looking at on the sort of 5G, 6G path is going to be fascinating.
Yeah, the DoD is looking at spectrum as like a fifth element. You've got land, sea, air, space, and they're looking at spectrum as an actual, just another environment that they need to maneuver in.
And just real quick too, I mean, and we're talking DoD, but I think for a lot of different federal equities and interests, you're going to see similar in this sort of coming together. And I mean, at least it gives me some optimism for sort of this interagency collaboration on some of this. I think, in our role at NTIA, we really know we need to be sort of at the forefront of bringing that all together and looking at a national approach to this, and then working with the commission on this, right, too, because there's a lot of overlap between these uses and reaching out to private sector and having these conversations. Because it's all coming together, and it's not just the terrestrial stuff, it's the space stuff, and it's all, really working together now in new and exciting ways.
The one thing I'll maybe add to that is that in building up this Spectrum Innovation Center with NSF, the shared incentives that we heard, everyone we talked to were concerned about getting the next generation workforce. Everyone we talked to was concerned about national competitiveness. And so I think the more we focus on those economic development, the more we focus on those as shared motivations, I think we can get aligned and perhaps collaborate and make better and better use of the spectrum. All right, so in cases of unavoidable harmful interference, how can the relative societal value of spectrum for various services be assessed? Does this approach have merit in resolving spectrum conflicts? Kind of gets to the financial side of what we talked about earlier. And I think Al wanted to jump in on this first.
Yeah, and I think it's really hard to just say that this is a pure financial issue, because then we have to somehow put a cost on environmental remote sensing observations of the planet, not just for weather, but also for climate. And so we've got to look at these all from long-term or short-term or perhaps local perspectives in terms of their costs. For example, right now, the cost of us not knowing that our climate is changing is quite considerable when you project this out to the future in terms of what we're going to have to be paying for the next hurricane that hits, et cetera, et cetera. So in other situations as well, I'll go back on that issue, because I'm not going to claim I'm holier than thou in saying that environmental applications are the only and best and highest purpose of spectrum. There are situations where spectrum should be used for other purposes. For example, in areas of conflict, and we have enough of those around the globe right now, the immediate environmental needs of spectrum probably have to take a backseat to strategic uses of spectrum. And same thing would happen in emergency scenarios, for example. So my point is, though, that we have to weigh these from not only short-term economic perspectives regarding the, let's say, quarterly bottom line of a company and how much tax they're going to pay, but we've also got to look at this from the standpoint of the longer-term costs of not having the information that certain spectrum might provide. And I think climate is the poster child for that particular application.
Jennifer?
Yeah, I actually fully agree. And that was kind of my point early on, that we have to kind of take a step back and really look at things before we do them, and don't go in with just a planned use. If there's important spectrum uses, which don't necessarily equal dollars and cents, but equal other societal benefits, you've got to take that into account, and you have to look at long-term implications as well. So I fully agree. I think that's very well said.
Derek?
I mean, I'm just really going to concur. I think that was articulated well, and I think we have a number of national priorities, and Austin mentioned that a lot of these do have spectrum implications, and I think that's everything we need to try to balance. And we're not losing sight of the economic side, but also a lot of these, whether it's climate or they also contribute to the economic picture too, right? So they're not entirely distinct, right? So a lot of difficult priorities, and that we need to balance as part of this.
I think my esteemed colleagues have covered most of them. Okay.
Yeah, maybe I'll just take the opportunity to throw in, I have had the opportunity to interact with a couple of economists along the way in building up our center at Notre Dame and this new initiative with SpectrumX. And once upon a time, there was a thought that sort of instead of raw market size, numbers in the billions, using tools from cost-benefit analysis might be helpful here. And the other is not just the I'm going to probably misquote this, but Tom Hazlett is on our team for SpectrumX, and he emphasizes the marginal utility as you explore trade-offs in different uses of spectrum. And so I think, in general, getting more of not just the engineers, but also the economists involved in these equations to try to come up with models that allow for us to explore the trade-offs could be helpful here. We may not get the absolute numbers, but we may be able to figure out relative numbers along the way. All right, so in fact, one of the things I was going to mention is, at least from my perspective, issues like the radar altimeters and the filters on the front ends of those altimeters. If 40 years ago, when some of those altimeters were designed, someone factored in the potential cost of having to upgrade those receivers, because there's some probability that the spectrum environment, would change over 10 years time frame or 20 years time frame. Maybe that kind of thinking about the long-term change of the surrounding spectrum environment could justify some initial additional expenses on the front ends of those filters. And that's my intent to transition into our next topic, which is that there are those that argue that setting receiver standards would solve everything here. So do you agree with that? Is that a long-term solution or only a temporary fix until other aspects of technology mature? And Melissa wanted to take that one up.
I think it doesn't fix everything, but it is so vital to the conversation. A large number, especially the big spectacular issues like the radar altimeters and Legato and I mentioned that name, and the GPS situations, receiver, it's not that the transmitting systems are going outside of what they were granted, it's it impact the receiver system. So it definitely we need both sides of the equation. We need both transmitter and receiver considerations when we're talking about standards, when we're talking about potential impacts and interference. To draw a little bit on what you just mentioned, if we had 10 years, how do we build in that technology going ahead? The NIST report, one of the things that they mentioned is because we've been fighting the GPS issue for so long, the manufacturers have already baked in solutions. And they've had almost 10 years to do it, but they've baked in solutions so that when the new systems do come online, they'll be fine. It's just there's a handful of the older systems that are still issues, and the DoD still has some systems that they're concerned about. But by and large, the industry has moved in that general direction on how to change their receivers in order to compensate for new uses, new neighbors to their spectrum. But one thing I also want to point out is when everyone read the roundtable report, right, that this is predicated on, right? One of the items noted in there is that we need an agreed upon definition of harmful interference is imperative, and common terminology. And as was mentioned in the last panel and this panel, there's no one definition. I would suggest that needs to be changed to, we need a framework, an approach to get to a common definition in a particular area that we're concerned about. don't think we're ever getting to a common definition. And then it's hard to separate, interference from technical impact to mission impact. So all of those things need to be rolled in. How they affect each other and how it varies versus what it was intended. So I have a long-winded answer, but I don't think it fixes everything, but I think it would fix a lot to have an approach to receiver standards, or a standard to get to a receiver standard in a particular area.
And to clarify, are you suggesting that the FCC should set the receiver standards, or just mandate that there needs to be a receiver standard and then have the industry come up with that standard?
Probably the latter. Coming from NIST and coming from the standards, we don't actually issue most of the standards. Most of the standards in the United States are issued as it's a joint coalition between industry and federal to come up with those standards. We're very different from other nations in that area. Other nations, they have a body, they make the standard, and it's a government-run institution, and that's that. Here, we took the exact opposite approach, where our standards really come from industry. And those joint coalitions.
Derek, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, just quickly. I mean, all that's right. I think receiver standards or performance requirements certainly play a role. As folks know, there's an inquiry from the commission right now going on. I mean, the problem is, one, that you have to define. You can set a receiver, threshold, but then you have to agree to what it is, and it is going to be different in different areas. We dug in a little bit on the federal side and realized we actually, everyone says there's no receiver standards, but that's more maybe on an FCC regulatory side to a certain extent, but we actually have quite a bit on the federal side that actually we do. There are a good amount of receiver performance requirements as part of, the NTIA process for managing spectrum. It's a number of areas. Typically it is adopting industry standards like TA standards in the land mobile space, and we have an effort going on right now that's actually looking at radar issues. So there is some out there, but again, it's not going to be a panacea. But I think even setting that expectation that your spectrum environment may change does help. But there's really no getting away from life cycle issues too, right? If you're a federal government system and you're going to have a system that operates for 20 years, it's a very different environment than if you're in the mobile wireless industry or on these short cycles. So you can work toward these things. It'll take a while, and then you just have to figure out how to, grandfather and roll things out. But I think there's pretty wide consensus that we need to look at the receiver issues more closely.
Al?
Well, I'm always in favor of better receiver standards because it'll increase the scarcity of engineers. But that said, we do this.
In a value.
We do this in the auto industry all the time. We do this through CAFE standards. We do this through auto emission standards. And this has changed the industry. It's changed it so much that we're now within a transition to electric vehicles. So yeah, I don't see why we can't do that. But I don't think we should stop at receivers, because receiver is half of it for a comm system. And we have to look at, of course, the other half of it as well. How do we make better schemes for communications that may even involve multiple modalities, not just using the spectrum, but perhaps using land services as well? So there are lots of what I'd call related technologies that could be brought into bear along with just the receivers. But a phased-in approach, I think that would make a lot of sense.
Anything on this one, Jennifer?
Yeah, so I think my one addition would be you really have to look at this in individual frequency bands and based on services. You can't just, receiver standards, yes, they're a good thing. I'm very pro standards, and I would agree entirely with Melissa. They should be driven by the standards bodies and not by regulators. I think we know technology is better than the government does, and I don't always think it works so well in other parts of the world. But I do think you've got to take a look and see what's there and how things are operating, and maybe even make certain priorities where there are more risks. I think Derek brought up a very good point about long-term systems, satellite systems like ours, we're GEOs, so we're up there for 15 years. Equipment has to talk. So you've got to look at this on a phased-in approach, but certainly support the overall concept.
All right, this kind of transitions into our sort of last planned question, which is, with all of the evolution of technology and demand from society, how do we regulate these industries where the products are evolving faster than the regulatory environment?
So, go ahead.
No, go ahead, Al.
And I've been thinking about this a little bit. You know, when you go back to the early 1900s in the history of radio, you go back to 1910, and you consider the rate of change of the frequency that which we were working at, whether it was the latest radio band or TV band or microwave band that people were using, or whether it was the latest contention that happened to be an object of the FCC or other regulating entities. This frequency doubles roughly every 6 years. It's sort of the one thing I think you can kind of count on, sort of a Moore's law. It's a doubling roughly every 6 years. And I've been thinking about why this doubling occurs. Part of it is people just wanting to develop better services, faster services, more data rate, go to higher frequencies, et cetera. But part of it also, some element of it, is the regulatory framework, which provides an element of a symbiosis, you might say. Because when you do begin to regulate a certain band, and all of a sudden new entities maybe can't play in that band as easily, it does force them to look to the higher frequencies and go to the more advanced technologies. So I think there is a symbiosis between regulatory and technology.
Should we be calling this Gasiewski's law?
I think Moore's got that, but
As a corollary, this is carrier frequency, right? You're referring to carrier frequency. Have you looked at the bandwidth as well? Because I know you've actually looked at data.
Yeah, bandwidth sort of grows proportionally to carrier frequency as well.
Queues and so on. Okay, great. Jennifer, go
Okay,
ahead.
I'm going to take it a little more into the weeds. So I think first off, we've got to pay attention to the table of allocations. The table of allocations sets forth broad services. There's a lot of desire to take spectrum away and make it for an application. So we see that internationally with the term IMT, and identifying bands has no regulatory meaning, but provides a guidepost. But we've also seen we have an agenda item at the WRC to create a allocation for low power narrowband MSS satellite systems. And things that may or may not pan out, and we've done this before. You can look at the US, of course, has always allocated spectrum perhaps more narrowly than other countries, things for utilities or public safety and so forth. And generally, those have not panned out in the most efficient use of spectrum. So I'd say, one, we have to go back to service-based allocations. I think we have to make sure that we provide, and I think the FCC does do a very good job on this in the US, generally does not dictate technologies that have to be used. I think that's incredibly important. And because we picked the wrong, I used to work for the best FCC commissioner ever. There's no FCC commissioner here, so I can say Kathleen Abernathy. And she always talked about how if we picked a standard for cellular, we would have picked the wrong standard at the FCC at that point. So I think technology, giving flexibility to operators, but you've got to pay attention to the radio services. And you've also got to guard events, and we're seeing a huge issue right now at the ITU plenipotentiary in Romania. You've also got to avoid and make sure that that operations on a non-interference basis are really non-interference. And you're seeing that in some what we call the plan. So I said this is very weedy, I apologize. In the plan bands at the ITU, which were bands that were developed in orbital locations for developing countries, and they're seeing increasing use by operators, and that's starting to take what they view as some of their rights, and they're looking to perhaps put the genie back into the model. So I do think you have to respect the table of allocations. It's worked really well, whether we like to say so or not, over the past years. And I've seen some blurring of this and some ways around it, but I think that would be a mistake, and I think we'd end up in a much worse position on interference than we are today.
Let me just say, given your comments, do we have the right set of services with the right definitions for moving forward? Because there's so much convergence of these different systems these days and applications.
It's a great question. I would say not, but you'd have to relook at the rules if you change the definitions for the existing services. So there's a great example. Once again, this I can't define. ESIMs, or Earth Stations in Motion, is using satellites to provide service to cruises and trucks. And so that you would say those satellite services are generally considered fixed satellite services. But you look at the use and you say, well, that's mobile. And there's been a huge fight, both domestically and internationally, how do you put that into that definition? We've been able to expand it, but I will tell you it's not been easy with some countries in particular raising very serious concerns about this, and whether that's right or wrong. So you're probably right. I would be certainly open, but then you've got to look at how that impacts. It goes back to what does that look like technically? It's a really nice idea, but you've got incumbent services and all these bans for years, and and that's what I mean. That's something the ITU does for better or worse. And I was talking to someone about whether I really love the process or not, and it's a love-hate. As noted from my notes to my secretary to send pencils so I can stick them in my eyes while I'm at meetings. But at the end of the day, we do go through the studies, and as painful it is, and all the different folks are there. And if you do put in a study, you at least get heard. It may not always be the right decision. There may be political decisions involved at the end of the day. I'm not saying that's right, but that sort of format actually allows you to look at it.
It reminds me that at certain points, after all the many amendments to the Wi-Fi standards, eventually they rolled them up into a brand new, complete standards document. Maybe there's a similar process that needs to be explored over longer timescales, probably with ITU. Did anyone else want to jump in on this?
So I'm kind of going a little bit of a bit of a direction too, but changes in technology, but also changes into our understanding and knowledge generally, particularly when it comes to the regulatory process. And I raise this because, and this is kind of what Jennifer said before, sometimes we have a goal that we want to make spectrum available for X, or we want to make a decision, we want to make it quickly. At the same time, we want certainty in those rules for the market participants. And there's a natural tension there and a trade-off, right? And I think we need to have a little more humility and flexibility that we know what all the answers are, right? And if you think about some of these recent examples, right? Like, going back to altimeters. I disagree with some comments earlier. It wasn't that the aviation industry, the FAA didn't say there were problems. They did. It was explaining them and justifying and doing the work and having the study so you could actually make decisions based on it, right? And now we're going through some exercises to try to, maybe make some minor mitigations that will help. And it was true back with the millimeter wave bands. We moved historically quickly, and everyone brings up 24 gigahertz. And again, we knew there was an issue for NOAA systems, but we couldn't the work wasn't done to figure out, what that protection criteria may be, and we did it later, right? And now we're trying to put that into the rule. So I think there's that, again, as things change and we have this, this interest in moving quickly and making decisions, I think we need to have humility that we can get better at things. And CBRS is another good example. We've made incremental improvements to that along the way, collaboratively working, with DoD, with the industry, with the FCC, NTIA, to make tweaks, and we're looking at more, right? Right now, we're looking at the model out there, and the SAS's work with the environmental sensing capabilities, and now we're not sure those ESCs are long-term the best way to go, and we're looking at new models like we're looking at an incumbent informing capability, the IIC system that maybe could be implemented there and in other bands. Some folks want to look at like power levels again, doesn't make sense. So I think, part of this, I think, is as technology evolves quickly and as we get better at sharing and other things is, because again, if we want to wait for the perfect answer, then we're not going to make the decisions. And unfortunately, some of this technical work, whether it's by federal agencies or other, takes a while. So, you can delay FCC proceedings or whatnot till we get the answers perfect, or you can move forward and understand, hey, we may need to tweak some rules here along the way, and I think there needs to be an openness to that.
It sort of sounds like agile software development, iterative.
Right.
Did you want to add anything, Melissa?
I agree with that, is that we need more data, we need to be, and then what you said earlier, we need to set the expectations that things might change in 5 or 10 years, and we need to adapt, and that's not written in stone until the end of eternity. So, and I did also want to mention before we log off is, I have a very interesting story about Dr. Moore and Moore's Law from the man himself, so you'll have to come to the discussion panel this afternoon to hear about it, though.
That's a good play. All right, well, that's what we prepared to discuss up here as a group, and now is a great time for us to transition into the Q&A and discussion session. So if there are any students that want to start off the questions, please feel free. Is this a student here?
The student, he's my old intern.
I'm looking around, not seeing too many students, so I think I'm going to jump in. it seems like balancing harmful interference and using spectrum efficiently has always kind of leaned towards stopping the harmful interference being the main focus. Should that shift now that we're kind of at the ends of useful spectrum? Should it shift toward people being more accepting of harmful interference to find better solutions?
Well, I'll just jump in quickly. I think there's a difference between accepting some interference and accepting harmful interference. Again, this gets to the definitional interest, right? I mean, if you're going to actually have harmful interference and as an incumbent, you have those protection rights, I don't think we'll ever accept that. I think the issue becomes, again, how, is tolerance to interference, right? And again, it's going to depend on the technology and the system, right? I mean, if you're talking about a safety of life system, your risk is going to be very different than if you're, say, commercial operator and a little bit of latency or something's not going to really be an issue for your subscriber. So I think that depends. It kind of ties back into how can we do a better job of maybe having a framework where those type of situations can be better worked out. Oftentimes they happen in the marketplace amongst providers, but from a regulatory perspective, are there tools?
So can I add in?
Please.
So I fully agree with Derek, and I would call it an acceptable level of interference, but I think that's getting harder. When we look at what's going on in the standards bodies, 5G, 3GPP for development of release 18, and you've got 6G on the horizon, you're starting to see higher and higher performance metrics. So you're not going to be as tolerant of latency delay, delay in a lot of systems. You're not going to, you're not going to be able to survive in the marketplace. So I think it's going to be, to the extent you do it, it kind of goes back to what does this look like? And then I don't know how that handles evolution over time as technology, as users demand better service, can you actually accept that level of interference? So I think that probably goes back to the debate of should we have a new definition of harmful interference, but maybe also acceptable interference.
Al?
I've got to second that from the standpoint of environmental observation, and our previous panelists spoke very eloquently about the need for extremely low levels of interference for weather forecasting, but it's only getting more so as we now start thinking about climate forecasting and climate observations that will allow us to make climate assessments, not on 30-year scales where we finally see the hockey stick moving up, but rather on 3-year scales. And these 3-year scales are going to be even more important when we, and I hate to say when, but I just am starting to think this way, when we punch through 1.5 degrees C of global warming. Because then we are really going to have to be taking measures that are much more extreme. And the precision that we will need, the level of harmful interference, is going to go even lower.
I think one thing might help that discussion is a lot of times when there are studies, they come back with a yes, no answer, right? It caused interference or it didn't. What we need is, you need to look at the data over the range of the total impact, all the way from very low to very high. So you can kind of see, how much that is and how fast it's changing. Because it might be, if I change my protection criteria a little bit, it might be that it's a very slow rise, so I can actually move quite far up the chain before there's an actual large impact. Or it might be if I tweak it just a little bit, it might have an immediate response. But a lot of times when you see people ask the question, did you cause interference or not, it's a yes, no question. And I think we need to have the spread of data to have a conversation about where that risk might best land.
I'll just maybe add that one of the views that we're taking in SpectrumX is to push on the resiliency of receivers. Not that you're ultimately going to accept harmful interference, but to make them more robust. And so resiliency, exploring trade-offs and coexistence in the spectrum is one of the big areas that we're pushing hard on. And I think I noticed Keith is standing here. We're standing between you all and lunch. So let me just ask that we take the opportunity to thank our panelists for their time and their insights. And of course, be sure to join our breakout group where Melissa is going to share that anecdote about Dr. Moore. Thank you.